The fluorescent lights of the Target fitting room cast harsh shadows across Daniel Martinez's face as he stood before the three-way mirror, holding a size 4 XL shirt that still felt too tight across his chest. At 32, he had perfected the art of avoiding full-length mirrors, shopping online to sidestep the humiliation of trying on clothes in public. But today was different. His sister Melissa had insisted they go shopping together for their cousin's wedding, and there was no escaping the reality that stared back at him from every angle. The man in the mirror weighed 340 pounds, and Daniel barely recognized himself anymore. "Danny, how's it going in there?" Melissa's voice carried through the thin door, tinged with the careful optimism she'd maintained throughout their shopping trip. She had driven down from Sacramento to their hometown of Fresno, specifically for this outing, sensing that her younger brother needed support, even if he'd never asked for it directly. At 35, Melissa had inherited their mother's protective instincts and their father's stubborn determination, qualities that had served her well as a high school counselor, but sometimes felt overwhelming when directed at her brother's struggles. Daniel stared at his reflection, seeing not just the physical weight he carried, but the emotional burden that had accumulated over years of failed diets, broken promises to himself, and the gradual withdrawal from social situations that required him to be seen. The wedding invitation had been sitting on his kitchen counter for 3 months, and he'd been finding excuses to avoid committing to attending. How could he face relatives he hadn't seen in years, endure their poorly disguised shock at his appearance, or worse, their pitying attempts to avoid mentioning his weight altogether? "I think we need to try a different store," he called back, his voice carrying the defeat he'd grown accustomed to hiding behind humor and deflection. But something about the exhaustion in his own voice struck him differently this time. Maybe it was the way the overhead lights seemed to emphasize every curve and fold of his body, or maybe it was the realization that he'd been having this same internal conversation for the past 5 years without taking any real action to change it. Fresno in late March carried the promise of Central Valley heat, but inside the air-conditioned store, Daniel felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He'd grown up in this city, played Little League baseball in Woodward Park, attended Fresno State University for 2 years before dropping out when his weight gain made him too self-conscious to continue attending classes. The familiar streets and landmarks of his hometown felt like witnesses to his gradual transformation from the outgoing kid who'd once dreamed of becoming a teacher to the man who now worked remotely as a graphic designer, rarely leaving his apartment except for necessities. When he finally emerged from the fitting room, Melissa was waiting with a patient smile that didn't quite hide her concern. She'd watched her brother struggle with weight since high school, had witnessed the cycle of hope and disappointment that accompanied each new diet attempt. But lately, she'd noticed something different in his demeanor, a resignation that frightened her more than his previous frustrated determination. "Let's grab some lunch," she suggested, immediately regretting the food reference when she saw Daniel's expression tighten. "Or coffee. There's that new place downtown that everyone's talking about." She linked her arm through his, a gesture they'd maintained since childhood, though she noticed how he seemed to shrink into himself when they walked past other shoppers, as if trying to minimize his physical presence in public spaces. The coffee shop was busy with the typical Saturday crowd of college students, young families, and middle-aged professionals catching up on weekend errands. Daniel chose a corner table, positioning himself with his back to most of the room, a habit Melissa had observed but never commented on directly. As they settled in with their drinks, black coffee for her, a large mocha with whipped cream for him, she decided to address what they'd both been avoiding discussing. "Danny, I'm worried about you," she began, her counselor training helping her navigate the delicate territory of expressing concern without triggering defensiveness. "Not just the weight, though, that's part of it. You seem so isolated lately. When's the last time you went out with friends, or even left your apartment for something fun rather than just necessary?" Daniel had been expecting this conversation, dreading it, but also secretly hoping it would happen. Living alone with his struggles had become its own kind of prison, where the freedom to eat whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, had gradually transformed into compulsive behaviors he no longer felt capable of controlling. His days had settled into a predictable routine: work from his home office, order food delivery, watch Netflix, sleep, repeat. The pandemic had given him a socially acceptable excuse for isolation, but even as the world reopened, he'd found reasons to stay hidden. "I know you mean well, Mel," he replied, using the childhood nickname that always softened conversations between them. "But it's not that simple. You don't understand what it's like to walk into a room and feel everyone's eyes on you, making judgments about your willpower, your health, your character, all based on how you look." His voice carried a weariness that made Melissa's heart ache for the confident, funny brother she remembered from their childhood. The truth was more complex than he could easily explain. Food had become both his comfort and his tormentor, the source of temporary pleasure that inevitably led to hours of self-recrimination and shame. He'd tried every diet that promised quick results, had joined gym memberships he never used, had downloaded apps that tracked everything from calories to steps to sleep patterns. Each failure reinforced his belief that he lacked some fundamental quality that would enable him to succeed where millions of others had. "What if I told you I've been thinking about weight loss surgery?" he said suddenly, the words emerging before he'd consciously decided to share this information. "I've been researching it online, reading about different procedures, success stories, complications. I even called a surgeon's office last week, though I hung up before scheduling a consultation." Melissa set down her coffee cup carefully, processing this revelation. As a counselor, she understood that sustainable change required addressing underlying emotional patterns, but she also recognized that her brother needed hope, needed to believe that transformation was possible. "Have you thought about what's driving the eating patterns?" she asked gently. "Not to judge, just to understand what you think might be different this time, whether it's surgery or some other approach." The question opened a door Daniel had been afraid to walk through. "I eat when I'm lonely, which is most of the time. I eat when I'm stressed about work deadlines. I eat when I'm happy about something and want to celebrate. I eat when I'm sad, angry, bored, excited. Basically, I eat for every emotion except hunger." His honesty surprised him, as if speaking these truths aloud made them real in a way that thinking them hadn't. As they sat in the bustling coffee shop, surrounded by people living their lives with apparent ease and confidence, Daniel felt simultaneously exposed and relieved. For the first time in months, he'd admitted to another person and to himself that his relationship with food had become a substitute for the human connections and life experiences he'd been avoiding. The weight wasn't just pounds on a scale, it was accumulated years of choosing immediate comfort over long-term well-being, isolation over vulnerability, food over life itself. 3 weeks after the conversation with Melissa, Daniel found himself sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Sarah Chen's bariatric surgery practice in downtown Fresno, his palms sweating as he completed the extensive intake paperwork that would determine his eligibility for gastric sleeve surgery. The office walls displayed before and after photos of successful patients, their transformations so dramatic they looked like different people entirely. Daniel studied their faces, searching for some hint of the emotional journey behind the physical changes, wondering if he possessed whatever internal quality had enabled their success. The decision to pursue surgery hadn't been impulsive, despite how it might appear to outside observers. Daniel had spent countless hours researching procedures, reading medical journals, participating in online forums where people shared their experiences with brutal honesty. He'd learned about dumping syndrome, malabsorption issues, the necessity of lifelong vitamin supplements, the possibility of complications both immediate and long-term. More importantly, he'd discovered that surgery was a tool, not a magic solution, and that many patients struggled with regaining weight if they didn't address the psychological factors that had contributed to their obesity. Daniel Martinez? A nurse called his name, and he followed her down a hallway lined with motivational posters about healthy living and goal achievement. Dr. T. Chen's office was warm and welcoming, designed to put nervous patients at ease, but Daniel felt his anxiety spike as he settled into the chair across from her desk. At 45, Dr. Chen had performed thousands of bariatric procedures and had developed an intuitive sense for which patients were mentally prepared for the challenges ahead. "Tell me about your relationship with food," she began, a question that might seem obvious but often revealed crucial insights about a patient's readiness for the lifestyle changes surgery would require. Not your diet history or what you've tried before, but how you experience eating, emotionally, socially, practically in your daily life. Daniel had rehearsed answers to anticipated questions, but Dr. Chen's approach caught him off guard. "Food is my best friend and my worst enemy," he said after a moment of consideration. "It's the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before sleep. I plan my day around meals, make decisions about social activities based on what food will be available, choose restaurants based on portion sizes and the likelihood that I can eat without judgment from other people." Dr. Chen nodded, making notes in his file while maintaining eye contact in a way that felt supportive rather than clinical. "What do you imagine your life will look like after surgery? Not just physically, but emotionally and socially?" This question revealed the depth of preparation, or lack thereof, that patients brought to the process. "Honestly, I have trouble imagining it at all," Daniel admitted. "I've been overweight since I was 12 years old. I don't really remember what it feels like to move through the world in a smaller body, to shop for clothes in regular sizes, to sit in airplane seats or restaurant booths without anxiety about fitting. Sometimes I try to picture myself at a normal weight, but it's like trying to imagine being a different person entirely." Deal. The assessment continued for nearly 2 hours, covering his medical history, family relationships, work situation, mental health status, and realistic expectations about post-surgical life. Dr. Chen explained that successful bariatric patients often required ongoing psychological support, that the surgery would change his stomach size but wouldn't automatically change his relationship with food, stress, or the emotions that had driven his eating patterns for decades. "I want you to understand," Dr. Chen said as the consultation drew to a close, "that this surgery will be the beginning of your journey, not the end. You'll need to commit to regular follow-up appointments, nutritional counseling, possible therapy to address emotional eating patterns, and a complete restructuring of how you approach food and eating. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" Daniel felt a mixture of excitement and terror at the prospect. Part of him wanted immediate transformation, the quick fix that would solve all his problems and allow him to start living the life he'd put on hold. But Dr. Chen's questions had forced him to confront the reality that lasting change would require work he wasn't sure he was ready to do. "I think I need some time to process all of this," he said finally. "Can I schedule a follow-up appointment in a few weeks?" Over the following days, Daniel found himself caught between hope and doubt, excitement and fear. He researched post-surgical meal plans, calculated the costs of protein supplements and vitamins, read testimonials from patients who described the surgery as the best decision they'd ever made, and others who struggled with complications or regain. The more he learned, the more he realized that success would depend not just on the surgical procedure, but on his ability to develop entirely new patterns of thinking about food, his body, and his place in the world. Melissa called him every few days to check in without being pushy about his decision. During one of their conversations, she mentioned that her gym offered personal training sessions and suggested he might benefit from working with someone who specialized in helping people establish healthy exercise habits. "Even if you decide on surgery," she said, Building some physical activity into your routine beforehand might help with recovery and long-term success. The suggestion initially made Daniel defensive. He'd had negative experiences with gyms and trainers in the past, encounters that left him feeling judged and inadequate. But something about his sister's tone suggested she'd given this recommendation serious thought rather than offering generic advice. "What kind of person?" he asked, surprised by his own curiosity. "His name is Alex Rodriguez, and he specifically works with people who are starting from square one with fitness." Melissa had done her research, knowing that her brother's past experiences with gyms had been discouraging. "He has a background in both exercise physiology and counseling. One of my colleagues worked with him after her divorce, when she needed to rebuild her confidence along with her physical health." Daniel felt intrigued despite his reservations. Maybe having professional support while he navigated the decision about surgery would help him feel more prepared, regardless of which path he ultimately chose. "Could you get his contact information?" he asked, taking what felt like his first proactive step toward change, rather than simply reacting to circumstances or other people's suggestions. That evening, as Daniel sat in his apartment contemplating the possibility of working with a trainer, he realized that something had shifted in his thinking over the past month. Instead of seeing his weight as an insurmountable obstacle that defined his limitations, he was beginning to consider it as a challenge that might be addressed through sustained effort and professional guidance. The change in perspective was subtle but significant. The difference between feeling like a victim of circumstances and feeling like someone capable of making meaningful choices about his future. For the first time in years, Daniel fell asleep, thinking about possibilities rather than limitations, imagining not just a smaller body, but a larger life filled with activities and experiences he'd been avoiding. The path ahead remained uncertain, but uncertainty had begun to feel like potential rather than paralysis. 6 months later, Daniel stood on the scale in Alex Rodriguez's private training studio, watching the digital display settle on 265 pounds, a loss of 75 pounds that represented not just physical transformation, but a complete restructuring of how he approached food, exercise, and his relationship with his own body. The number should have felt like victory, and in many ways it did. But Daniel was discovering that losing weight brought unexpected emotional complications alongside the celebrated physical benefits. Alex Rodriguez had turned out to be everything Melissa had promised, and more. At 38, the trainer combined a background in exercise science with an intuitive understanding of the psychological barriers that prevented people from maintaining healthy lifestyles. Unlike Daniel's previous experiences with fitness professionals who focused exclusively on physical training, Alex treated exercise as just one component of overall well-being, integrating discussions about stress management, sleep patterns, and emotional eating into their sessions. "How are you feeling about the progress?" Alex asked, though his tone suggested he'd detected something in Daniel's demeanor that went beyond celebration of the scale victory. After 6 months of working together, he'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when his clients were struggling with aspects of transformation that weren't immediately visible to outside observers. "Physically, I feel better than I have in years," Daniel replied, settling into the conversation they'd learned to have after each weigh-in. "I can walk upstairs without getting winded. I sleep better. I have more energy during the day. But emotionally, it's complicated." He paused, searching for words to describe experiences that felt difficult to articulate even to himself. The complications had started around the 50-pound mark, when Daniel began noticing that other people were treating him differently. Co-workers who had barely acknowledged him for years suddenly engaged him in conversations, asked about his weight loss journey, complimented his appearance. Women made eye contact with him in public spaces, and he occasionally caught people looking at him with what seemed like approval rather than judgment. The positive attention should have felt rewarding, but instead, it triggered anger and sadness. about the years he'd been essentially invisible. "I find myself getting resentful," Daniel continued, his voice carrying a frustration that had been building for weeks. "People are treating me like I'm more valuable as a human being just because I weigh less. It makes me angry that I was apparently disposable when I was heavier, and it makes me question whether the positive attention I'm getting now is really about me as a person or just about my appearance." Alex nodded with the understanding that came from having guided dozens of clients through similar emotional territory. "Weight loss can be a grief process," he explained. "You're not just losing pounds. You're losing the identity you've carried for years, the ways you've learned to navigate the world, sometimes even relationships with people who are uncomfortable with your changes. It's normal to feel confused about who you're becoming." The identity crisis had manifested in unexpected ways. Daniel found himself standing in front of mirrors longer than necessary, still surprised by his reflection, but not entirely comfortable with the person looking back. He'd had to buy new clothes multiple times as his size continued to decrease, each shopping trip a surreal experience of discovering that he could fit into sizes he hadn't worn since high school. But the physical changes were outpacing his mental adjustment, creating a disconnect between how he looked and how he felt inside. "There's something else," Daniel said, his voice dropping as he approached a topic he'd been avoiding for weeks. "I'm terrified that I'm going to gain it all back. Every day I wake up afraid that I'll lose control and return to my old eating patterns. I have nightmares about stepping on the scale and seeing the numbers going back up. Sometimes I catch myself eating less than I should because I'm so afraid of eating too much." This confession revealed one of the most challenging aspects of significant weight loss: the psychological work required to maintain new behaviors while managing the fear of regression. Alex had observed this pattern in many clients who achieved dramatic physical transformations, but struggled with the mental and emotional adjustments required to sustain their progress long term. "Let's talk about what control actually means," Alex suggested, leading Daniel through a conversation that would become a turning point in his journey. "You've been trying to control your eating through restriction and fear, but that's not sustainable. Real control comes from understanding your triggers, developing healthy coping mechanisms, and learning to trust yourself to make good choices most of the time while accepting that perfection isn't the goal." Over the following weeks, their training sessions evolved to include more explicit discussions about emotional eating, stress management, and the difference between motivation driven by self-improvement versus motivation driven by self-punishment. Daniel began to recognize patterns in his eating behaviors that corresponded to specific emotions and situations. How he craved certain foods when he felt lonely, how he sometimes ate beyond satiety when he was celebrating achievements, how stress at work triggered urges to return to old comfort foods. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult session, where Daniel confessed that he'd been restricting calories to dangerously low levels out of fear that eating normal portions would lead to immediate weight regain. "I know it's not logical," he said, "but I feel like I can only trust myself if I'm constantly hungry. If I eat until I feel satisfied, I start panicking that I'm losing control." Indeed, Alex helped Daniel understand that his current relationship with food was still driven by fear rather than health. That sustainable weight maintenance required learning to eat adequate amounts of nutritious food while occasionally enjoying treats without guilt or panic. They developed strategies for recognizing true hunger versus emotional eating impulses, techniques for managing anxiety around food choices, and plans for handling social situations that involved eating without triggering old patterns of shame or restriction. "The goal isn't to never struggle with food again," Alex explained during one of their sessions. "The goal is to develop tools for managing those struggles when they arise, and to trust yourself to get back on track after setbacks without giving up entirely." This perspective shift helped Daniel begin to see his journey as an ongoing practice, rather than a destination he needed to reach and then maintain perfectly forever. By the end of his 8th month of working with Alex, Daniel had lost 90 pounds and, more importantly, had begun to develop a healthier relationship, not just with food and exercise, but with himself. He still had difficult days, still experienced anxiety about social situations and clothing choices, still struggled with the fear of regaining weight. But he'd also started to experience moments of genuine self-compassion, times when he could acknowledge his progress without immediately focusing on how far he still had to go or how easily it could all be lost. The mental and emotional work was proving to be more challenging than the physical aspects of weight loss, but Daniel was beginning to understand that lasting transformation required both components. He was learning to celebrate not just the numbers on the scale, but the development of skills and perspectives that would serve him regardless of his weight. The ability to handle stress without turning to food, the capacity to enjoy physical activity, and most importantly, the growing belief that he deserved to take up space in the world, regardless of his size. 1 year and 3 months after his first meeting with Alex, Daniel stood in his bedroom, preparing for his cousin's wedding, the same event that had initially motivated his shopping trip with Melissa and sparked his transformation journey. The man adjusting his tie in the mirror had lost 150 pounds, dropping from 340 to 190, a weight he hadn't seen since his sophomore year of college. But as he studied his reflection, Daniel realized that the most significant changes weren't visible in photographs or reflected in clothing sizes. The suit he wore was a 40 regular, purchased just 2 weeks earlier because his previous outfit had become too large. Shopping for clothes had evolved from a source of shame and frustration into something approaching normalcy, though he still occasionally caught himself reaching for larger sizes out of habit before remembering his current measurements. The physical transformation was undeniable. His face had regained definition, his posture had improved as carrying less weight allowed him to stand straighter, and he moved with an ease and confidence that had been absent for years. But Daniel had learned that sustainable weight loss required more than physical changes. The mental and emotional work he'd done with Alex, supplemented by therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in eating disorders and body image issues, had helped him develop tools for managing the psychological aspects of his transformation. He'd learned to recognize the difference between physical hunger and emotional eating impulses, developed strategies for handling stress that didn't involve food, and most importantly, begun to separate his self-worth from the number on the scale. "You look incredible," Melissa said when she arrived to drive him to the wedding, her voice carrying genuine pride mixed with something deeper, relief, perhaps, or recognition that her brother had reclaimed parts of himself that had been buried under years of weight and shame. She'd watched his transformation not just physically but emotionally, observing how he'd gradually become more willing to engage socially, more open to new experiences, more present in conversations rather than constantly monitoring how others might be judging his appearance. The wedding reception was held at a vineyard outside Fresno, the kind of venue that would have triggered intense anxiety for Daniel just over a year earlier. Outdoor events meant uncomfortable folding chairs, buffet lines where his food choices would be visible to everyone, and social interactions with relatives he hadn't seen in years who would inevitably comment on his appearance. But as they walked toward the celebration, Daniel felt nervous excitement rather than the dread that would have characterized his previous approach to such events. The reactions from family members were everything he'd anticipated and more. Aunts and cousins who hadn't seen him in years did double takes, asked about his secret, complimented his appearance with enthusiasm that felt both gratifying and occasionally overwhelming. "You look like a completely different person," his Aunt Carmen exclaimed, a comment that would once have felt like validation, but now prompted a more complex emotional response. "I'm still the same person," Daniel replied, a statement that reflected months of therapy work around identity and self-worth. "I've just learned healthier ways of taking care of myself." The response came naturally, without defensiveness or the need to downplay his achievement, representing a balance he'd worked hard to achieve between acknowledging his progress and maintaining perspective about what that progress actually meant. During the reception, Daniel found himself engaged in conversations that felt genuine rather than performative. He danced, something he hadn't done in public for over a decade, without constantly worrying about how his movement looked to others. He ate the wedding cake without guilt or panic about derailing his progress, having learned to distinguish between occasional treats and the compulsive eating patterns that had previously controlled his life. Most significantly, he felt present in the moment, rather than constantly monitoring his appearance or anticipating judgment from others. Alex had prepared him for this phase of maintenance, explaining that keeping weight off required ongoing attention to the habits and mindset changes that had enabled the loss in the first place. Daniel had developed a sustainable routine that included regular exercise he actually enjoyed, a combination of strength training and hiking that felt more like recreation than punishment, and eating patterns based on nutrition and satisfaction rather than restriction and fear. "The hardest part," Daniel confided to Alex during one of their maintenance sessions, "is trusting that this is sustainable. I still have moments where I'm convinced I'm going to wake up tomorrow having gained back all the weight, like it was all temporary, and I'm fundamentally still the same person who got to 340 pounds. These fears were normal, Alex assured him, part of the ongoing psychological work required to maintain significant weight loss. But Daniel had also experienced moments of genuine integration, times when his new lifestyle felt natural rather than effortful, when healthy choices emerged from preference rather than willpower. He'd started dating, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence as he learned to trust that his worth as a partner wasn't determined solely by his appearance. His work performance had improved as his energy levels increased and his confidence grew, leading to new opportunities and professional recognition he'd been avoiding when he felt invisible. The most profound change, however, was in his relationship with himself. Daniel had learned to practice self-compassion, to treat himself with the same kindness he would offer a good friend facing similar struggles. When he occasionally overate or skipped workouts, he'd learned to view these instances as temporary lapses rather than evidence of fundamental failure, to resume healthy habits without the self-punishment that had previously led to cycles of restriction and binging. "I used to think that losing weight would solve all my problems," Daniel reflected during a conversation with Melissa 6 months after the wedding. "What I've learned is that it solved some problems while creating others, and that the real work was learning to live in a body and a life that felt authentic to who I wanted to be." His transformation had become about much more than weight loss. It was about reclaiming agency over his choices, developing resilience in the face of challenges, and learning to value himself based on character and actions rather than appearance alone. As Daniel looked toward the future, he felt cautiously optimistic about his ability to maintain his progress while continuing to grow as a person. He'd learned that sustainable change required ongoing attention and effort, but also that the skills he'd developed, stress management, emotional regulation, healthy coping mechanisms, served him in all areas of life, not just weight maintenance. He'd become someone who could handle challenges without turning to food for comfort, who could enjoy social occasions without anxiety about his appearance, and who could pursue goals and relationships with confidence rather than shame. The 150 pounds he'd lost represented more than physical weight. They symbolized years of self-doubt, isolation, and limited possibilities that he'd gradually replaced with self-acceptance, connection, and a life that felt genuinely his own. Daniel had learned that lasting transformation required not just changing his body, but changing his mind, developing new relationships with food, movement, and himself that could sustain both his physical health and emotional well-being for the years ahead.